This is now day 2. But perhaps I should be careful not to make this sound like an ordeal, even though it is an ordeal. No, this is not just something that happened to me by accident. I'm here by choice. Last night I had a terrible dream. No, I am a dreamer. That has already been established. Most of my dreams are harmless, if vivid. And I dream about the same thing that most men dream of. But not always. Last night was different and disturbing. Franz Kafka, the famous Czech writer, wrote a powerful book in which the protagonist is transformed overnight into a giant cockroach. Now, I've studied some basic psychology, and I know that Kafka was actually talking about something else. Something abstract. The cockroach was symbolic of a form of alienation that Kafka felt at the time. He wasn't writing about a cockroach. But the character knew that he was still alive, even though he had been transformed into a giant cockroach. My dream was different. In my dream, I did not even know myself. I was invisible to everyone, even myself. I was trapped inside a void, silent, like the grave, dust. Bodiless, a specter, disintegrated and without form. This was me, except that I did not know that it was myself. Only that a faint form of consciousness, a figment of inertia, a dull lassitude issued from the mass of nothingness. When I was younger, I read much psychology, early fundamental psychology. I read Freud's interpretation of dreams, and I was impressed with the scope of his knowledge and the uniqueness of his ideas. But I quickly lost interest when he introduced the Oedipus complex, for it was just too far from where my mind was at the time. But then I discovered Jung, Carl Jung, and I was completely astonished by his ideas, for they were deeper than anything I ever imagined. He introduced a concept called the collective unconscious. This is a form of universal knowledge that is present inside the architecture of the mind. It is a form of knowledge without precedent, without and separate from experience. Like some form of collective library of thought from everyone that has ever existed, stored and synergized in the cloud. Now this is where my dream had taken me. I was sure of it. But I did not want to go there. And I never want to go there. Because one first has to strip away the encumbrance of the soul. And that place is dark, lonely, and horrible. And this is where the dream is leading me. I went down to the restaurant, but I could not clear my mind of the suffocating dream. I sat and looked at the menu. It was still early, so the room was sparsely occupied. A few couples, a businessman with his paper. All of them resigned to their own private thoughts. and I felt guilty even looking at them, as if it were I that were infringing upon their sacred space. The dream was still affecting me, I realized. In a few minutes, the waitress came over to greet me and pour my coffee. I don't know how she knew I was a coffee drinker, but she was determined to pour me a steaming cup. I smiled and engaged her in conversation for a few minutes, and the graceful cheerfulness of her helped me to shake off the anxiety, the torpor of my dream. I told her that I loved her city, as if Edinburgh belonged to her alone. She smiled and then went off to place my order. I had a great breakfast and left a couple pounds for the waitress, even though the tip was included in my bill. Then I went out and walked to the Scott Monument, a fantastic 200-foot tall Gothic structure built out of stone near the Princess Street Gardens. There was an empty bench beneath a large willow tree. I sat down and tried to compose my thoughts. What was I doing here? It just seemed so strange to me now. I am married, and yet I travel alone across an ocean just to ask a man about a book. A book of words, just words. These words have nothing to do with me, and yet I am drawn to them and somehow imagine that they have a connection to me. But still, I could not understand the importance of this book, and why, if it were so important, it had been given to me. Just a small man sitting beneath a gigantic monument to a writer of words long since turned to dust. People were all around me, for the monument is near the beautiful gardens. It was once a dirty loch. People walked past me on their way to destinations unknown, intent inside of their own little world made out of their own desires and a handful of people. They walked past me, but they didn't even notice, though I was sitting right in front of them. Look at me, for God's sake, I wanted to shout. Suddenly I felt a bitter loneliness that I could not explain. I am a very solitary man, and yet I felt alone in the middle of such a sea of humanity. The dream was doing this to me. I knew that. I felt like I was beginning to dissolve, just as in the dream. No, I must stay alert, I told myself. At last, I got up and started walking. Up Princess Street I walked, and then up Frederick Street until I crossed George Street, where I found a pub that I thought looked interesting. It was called the Queen's Arms. When I went in, I immediately recognized it, for I had been there with my brother and a bandmate the first time I was in Scotland. Quaint, indeed, for there is a small library right inside the pub. I sat down at a small table alongside the stacks and ordered a pint. I was just finishing my second pint when someone spoke to me. I looked up into the face of an attractive, mature woman. "May I join you?" she asked. I looked around the pub awkwardly before saying, "Be my guest." "You looked lonely," she said. "When I see people that look lonely, I always want to sit with them." "You are very observant," I answered. "So, you like to sit down with total strangers. What else do you like to do?" "We're not strangers anymore," she said with a smile. "Are you married?" "Yes," I replied. "So am I. So now we both have something in common." I was becoming very uncomfortable, but I could not take my eyes off of her. She held me in her gaze and would not let me look away. But I did not want to look away. There was something in her eyes like the diamond eyes of a cobra that held me. "I can tell that you are an American," she said with a laugh. "Americans are always so lonely," she said. "That is because we only love ourselves," I answered, and I laughed too. "That's so true," she said with a beautiful, lyrical laugh. And she laid her hands upon mine casually, in a friendly manner. The warmth from her hands went through me like the spreading poison of a bite from a serpent. But I did not pull them away. I continued to look into her eyes. "Your hands are so cold," she said. We talked for an hour or two about the selfishness of people and the darkening of the world. Not a subject that most strangers would discuss. But I found that something strange was happening to me. Something very strange. I was further dissolving again, right into the consciousness of this strange, empathetic creature. My dream was returning again. I felt panic, a panic attack, though I had never had one before now. I won't even mention in this log how I got away from her, because I am too embarrassed by my own actions. But once I was safely in the bustling street again, I went back to my hotel as fast as possible and checked out, for I was free of the Lamia. Then, with my travel bag on my back, I hurried back to the bookseller. He remembered me, but he did not smile or make any kind of gesture at all. "I am ready," I said. Perhaps 20 minutes later, a motor car pulled up in front of the shop. A man wearing a brown derby got out of the car and stood next to it, waiting for me to come out of the shop. He opened the door for me and waited for me to sit down before closing the door and getting into the driver's seat. I sat in the back seat. He turned around and said that there was a bottle of Glenfiddich in a glass next to me. Then he said that the drive would be long and that I should get comfortable, but that he was instructed not to speak further. I acknowledged his comment and waited for him to pull away from the curb. In a few minutes, we were out of the city. So I poured a glass of whiskey and looked out of the window at the spectacular scenery of mountains and hills and lochs. His driving was methodical and smooth, and I soon fell asleep. When I woke up, I didn't know how long I had been asleep, but it was dusk. Suddenly, the door opened and my driver stood there, waiting for me to get out. "This is as far as I can take you," he said. And then he pointed to a hill just outside of where we were stopped. "Follow the hill to the top," he said. "There's a cottage there. You are expected for supper." Then he nodded to me politely before getting into the car and driving away. I am an avid hiker, so the incline was simple for me. The landscape was beautiful with thick purple gorse, pink heather, Scotch broom, dense, wiry grass, and a stony, rocky soil. Perfect for sheep, I supposed. I could see the cottage as I ascended the hill. It was a small, whitewashed structure with a thatched, peaked roof, just exactly like I imagined it would be. When I got to the door, it opened before I could even knock. And there stood M. His beard was long and thick, his eyes narrow like the eyes of a vulture, and the lines on his face told a story of hard work and deep thought. He wore a simple shirt beneath a woolen sweater, for there was already a chill in the air. "Welcome, Kay. Come in," he said. "Our dinner is almost ready. My house is your home while you are here." The common room of the cottage was taken up mostly with a large wooden table and thick wooden chairs. An oil lamp hung from the ceiling and lit the room with a shimmering yellow light. Dinner consisted of stew made from lamb, bread, butter, and fresh water. He encouraged me to eat with relish and that after dinner we would talk over a dram. The food was delicious without being too spicy, for M had nothing to prove with his culinary skills, he said. When dinner was finished, I helped him to wash the dishes, and then we retired into the other side of the cottage, to a small sitting room overlooking the land about his property. "The sheep are out," he said. "They will return when darkness falls." He poured out a very generous dram, handed it to me, and then poured one for himself. He took out 2 cigars and handed one to me. "I do know that you smoke cigars," he said with a smile. "You should be careful what you post on the internet." "You get the internet here in these dark hills?" "Only when I travel to Glasgow," he answered. He trimmed and then lighted his cigar and waited for me to finish. "Now then, as I have said, you may call me M." "But how can that be? How can you be M?" I interrupted him awkwardly. Then I apologized. Please go on," I said. "It is all right," he replied. "I am M, just as my father and his father and his father have been called, all the way back to Melanthros, the original curator of this book. Yes, Melanthros had children. It was he that managed to get the book back after King Sigmus could no longer tolerate it. And the book was saved from a fiery ending if he had succeeded. In this family, Melanthros is admired and he is never forgotten. Unfortunately, he met a terrible end, even though he lived quietly in Edinburgh. But as you know, the church never forgets. And soon Melanthros was tracked down and brought away in chains, only to live out the final year of his life in a cold, damp prison. He sighed as if the memory were of one of his own children. I could not understand the genuine sorrow on his face. He continued. They claimed that he was a sorcerer, but he was not a sorcerer. No, he was a man of God. The sorcery of this book came not from Melanthros nor from Sorin. The sorcery of this book was put on it by the man from the trees, the man who gave it to Sorin. But what is the purpose of this book, I asked. Why was this given to Sorin, who only learned to read by the grace of King Sigmas? There must have been a better man to have given this book to, I added. Or perhaps Sorin was the perfect person to receive this book, as were you. It all depends upon the purpose of the book. But perhaps you have not even figured that out yet. And that is why you have come here. Am I correct? Yes, I answered. Now, listen carefully, for I am about to tell you the purpose of the book. I believe that this book is a form of machine, a time machine, except that the reader does not travel backward and forward in time. Instead, it is the writer that travels through time, in this case, Sorin. It is the words that allow the reader to do this, for the words are coded magic. The purpose may surprise you. The purpose is to keep the world from collapsing into a mindless lethargy. This book was written to bring forth memories like the soft, lilting sounds of a violin. The man from the trees has left a legacy of his own thoughts. The man from the trees was a true sorcerer. I drank down my glass and looked up into his eyes. They were solemn and serious. I asked him, how could the man from the trees accomplish this? For this book was given to Sorin. Have you read the entire book? M asked. No, I have not, I answered. Have you not seen the symbols? Have you not seen the strange, undecipherable writing? What have you been doing with this book? I stopped reading it, I admitted. I was having terrible dreams, anxiety, depression. I had to leave the book before it made me sick. But you are sick, said M. If you have read the book, then you have already been influenced by its presence, just as Melanthros was, and it led to his imprisonment. I was speechless. The room was now in total darkness except for the small glow of light that illuminated us. It had happened so fast, or was it my perception of time being altered? It is too late to be discussing this subject, he said with resignation. I will take you to your room. We will speak further in the morning. Then he picked up my travel bag and I followed him to a door at the end of the cottage. He opened the door and then went in and lit the oil lamp on the nightstand. He opened a window and said, "The night air will help you to sleep. Do not be frightened by the noises of the night. I will see you in the morning, and good night." He closed the door behind him and I was left alone. My head was reeling. My brother Dan was reading the book now. He will discover the symbols and wonder what they are. On the nightstand was a pitcher of water in a glass. I poured a glass and drank it down. Then I went to the window and leaned out. The air was cool and fresh, and the scent of the foliage was like a powerful perfume. In the distance, I could hear the baying and bleating of sheep as they wandered home. Just as Em had said, my mind was racing, so I sat on the bed with my phone, and I recorded this entry. My second day in Scotland.